Games that have been in development a long time are becoming more and more common, with players directing their ire only at certain titles or franchises while overlooking their favourites or ones they're just looking forward to. The latest release in that category being S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, which was originally announced back in 2010 and came from a trilogy of games, but it itself was cancelled in 2012. After reviving the project in 2018, it would be another 6 years before S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 Heart of Chernobyl would actually reach gamers. Now personally, this isn't an issue for me, or a slight towards the developer's CSG game world. If I'm interested in a game, I'm happy to wait for it. However, it is worth mentioning that it's something that I've always found annoying, especially recently, and I feel like gamers really need to be a bit more realistic when picking which games to attack or defend due to development time. That's just food for thought. But today we'll be talking about S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 Heart of Chernobyl, a game I've been mega excited to get my hands on for a while now. It's also worth noting that despite owning all of the original trilogy, I've never actually played them. Unfortunately, I allowed them to fall into the I'll get around to it pile, which I never got around to. But before diving into the review, if you enjoy the content, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. It is super appreciated. Being thrown into the game, we start off sleeping in the back of a truck, listening to a radio interview, and clutching a rock we found supposedly in our laundry basket. Off in the distance, thunder and ominous red lightning flash across the horizon, indicating that there is an emission coming. For those who are new to the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise, an emission is something which you will be introduced to very quickly after your initial set of missions. The sky goes red, and a nasty looking vortex of lightning appears in the sky and starts zapping down to the ground. During the introductory mission, which teaches you about the missions, it is taught to you by another stalker that if you are caught outside during an emission, you will be put in the ground. And this is a lesson that will probably be brought into practice at some point during your gameplay, as I have discovered the hard way that not all buildings provide ample cover from emissions, which has resulted in me being unalived a couple of times. Putting emissions on the back burner for now though, after our initial cutscene we are thrown into a new slew of issues which plagued me for no less than 40 minutes during a live stream, which I will admit was not one of my finest moments, but it did mark one of the strangest problems I've ever faced while playing a game, the control scheme or lack thereof. Now while it is true that I do typically go through the controls for every new game, because there are always some controls I inevitably do change, S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, not wanting to be outdone by any previous game I'd played, wanted to throw me for an absolute curveball. When you are initially dumped into the playable part of the game, you are given the keybinds on a little pop-up in your screen. But the catch is that these only stay on the screen as long as you don't touch anything, so the second you move forward or look around, they go away. During this initial pop-up, I had completely missed the keybind for my torch because I immediately started moving forward, only to very quickly end up in a pitch black section which had no light whatsoever, so obviously I was completely blind. With no way forward at this point in time, I decided I'd fall back and check my keybinds once again, and lo and behold, there's no keybind for the torch. By this point in time, I had already come across my first bug, which was one of the anomalies disappearing, and I thought that perhaps I didn't have a torch yet, and that I was supposed to follow the anomaly through the tunnel and follow its light. So with my only autosave not reloading the anomaly, I decided I would just start over from scratch. It is at this point that I noticed the little tiny pop-up that actually told me what the key was for my torch. Entirely unamused by all this, I decided that this would be the first thing that I'd actually raise in this review, is that there are several key bindings that you cannot bind because they simply don't exist. And I also feel like it was worth making a note out of, because surely to God I wasn't the only clown who actually missed that pop-up. The second issue you get introduced to really early on in the tutorial mission is how incredibly spongy all the enemies are. Well, you won't see any of this in the on-screen gameplay that I've recorded, because by the time I had recorded it, I'd actually modded the game to make the enemies a little bit more reasonable. I really want to summarize that my initial experience actually mirrors a lot of many other people's. During the tutorial mission, there are 3 mutant enemies and 3 human enemies. The second mutant that you'll run into is known as a bloodsucker. The bloodsuckers are an enemy that can actually go invisible, and at time of writing they are supposedly a little bit broken. They frustratingly and unintentionally jump around erratically, and they have been forcing most players to just unload all of their ammunition that they get in the tutorial just to try and put this thing down. The sponginess doesn't stop there though, persisting even with human enemies who also require a significant amount of ammunition unless headshots are used to put them down. The whole thing contrasts sharply with the gameplay trailers, which showcased you being able to put down enemies in a reasonable amount of time. It is super deceptive that when you go into the game, you find enemies, just basic enemies, sitting there taking everything you throw at them without so much as flinching. A pellet dispenser at point blank range should make anything human-sized stop, if only for a moment. That's all I'm saying. Thankfully though, ammo does tend to be relatively common, especially the Soviet ammo. As a general rule though, it's often better to avoid or bait mutants into groups of NPCs if you do find that there are any nearby. Stealth is also an option when fronted with human enemies, but I've encountered enemies spotting me both through walls and across fields to such an extent that had I not had the actual warning indicator on my HUD, I wouldn't have known they were there until I was being used as target practice. Essentially, for stealth to be an option, you basically need to crouch and approach them from the next state over, because once they see you, they seem to inherently know where you are at all times, regardless of where you decide you want to move. Very rarely have I seen an enemy lose track of me after relocating. The modding community is having a crack at these issues though, but the current mod I'm using at least feels a little bit overtuned. Nearly all enemies also have a tendency to seek cover if a player positions himself advantageously before taking the first shot. As a frustrating example, if you encounter dogs or mutant animals and stand on top of something where they can't get you, they'll actually scatter and cover behind an object outside your line of sight. Deliberately outside your line of sight. And they will actually stay there or relocate depending on how you move until you go somewhere where they're able to attack you. This is a mechanic that is frustrating beyond belief, as how can a wild animal exhibit this level of intelligence? And not only that, the dogs that you encounter are bloody blind. Once we enter the first village though, we encounter the next part of the game, the tragic and broken economy as well as the weapon repair system. As of writing, the economy feels, and it probably is, entirely broken. Repairing and selling a weapon nets you only half of the cost of repairing it. This combined with the very limited carry capacity means that hoarding weapons and shinies to sell is a lost cause, as you'll rarely, if ever, profit from what you loot. Moreover, any item that falls below a certain durability threshold cannot be sold, making it more practical to collect ammo and borrow new weapons as needed instead of repairing your old ones. There is a glitch in the game at the moment which does allow you to sell equipment for better prices, which I might have exploited during my playthrough. In many cases, especially after a particularly damaging excursion, this was the only way I could have possibly kept my gear functional given the exorbitant repair costs of armor and especially upgraded weapons towards your endgame. Speaking of though, the weapon system is also problematic, and I would honestly advise focusing on it only later on in your playthrough. What's unfortunately exacerbating this is that there are some players reporting that they're paying for an upgrade and it isn't applying, forcing them to reload a save and reapply the upgrade. Later upgrades also tend to be prohibitively expensive unless you're using a certain exploit. Essentially, if you're playing the game properly, it's probably better to just procure a new weapon off a corpse and take any ammo rather than trying to repair and upgrade your current one until much later on in the game. The much vaunted A-Life system, a hallmark of the Stalker franchise, is also currently broken, with developers acknowledging that fixes will come eventually, but they won't actually specify when. I'm unsure if this is linked directly to the A-Life system or not, but there was one very early mission I had where mutant dogs continually spawned, which forced me to flee the area after running out of ammo entirely. And this wasn't an isolated experience. I came across several locations where defeating one enemy immediately triggered the spawning of another. This can be disastrous if you're not paying attention or you're just unaware that it's happening. The first town does though show us the state of the zone and the interactions between the factions, and that escalates incredibly rapidly. Further heading out and exploring the zone, it's clear that every faction despises one another for reasons that seem far beyond what could be considered normal, and these tensions only slightly blur whenever these factions come under duress. I would go as far as to say that these interactions frequently come across as artificial and inhuman, and a lot of the cutscenes unfortunately have massive amounts of camera shakes, so good luck to all of you out there who get motion sickness really easily. These interactions extend to idle chatter, with NPCs constantly repeating the same 3 or 4 jokes, and I really use the term joke loosely. While there may be a deeper lore behind these jokes that I'm unaware of just because I'm a Stalker newbie, I would honestly genuinely like to hear more normal and natural conversations that isn't just a scripted conversation about something I did 5 minutes earlier. On that note though, it was refreshing to see NPCs discussing certain quests that I'd completed, like when I went and did the Poppyfield side quest. Whereupon, returning to town, there were a group of NPCs talking about my actions, albeit in a negative light since I took all of their energy drinks. This small detail does add depth to the world, which I truly do appreciate in games that have such an expansive environment, despite that same group returning to their dim-witted jokes the next time I pass by. Continuing on with the topic of conversations though, it's common for audio effects such as radio static or tunnel echoes to just stop working mid-conversation, which occurs more frequently than it really should. This issue tends to pop up a lot more frequently during situations where you can actually move around while having the conversation with an NPC, but it isn't the only significant immersion-breaking element. The game also suffers from a severe case of Smurfette principle, as I've encountered only 3 female characters throughout my whole playthrough, despite having explored an entire scientific facility filled with non-combatant combatants. It is a wild concept to behold, and something which I noticed fairly early on. And while I do somewhat understand that it is largely a combat zone and perhaps females would be scarce, I would have then expected to see female staff amongst the civilians in the research facility, but I don't recall seeing a single female there except for one character who I'm not actually sure is even human. On a more positive note regarding the NPCs though, there are cameos from previous characters who play integral roles depending on your choices, which will no doubt be a nostalgic touch for those familiar with the original trilogy and how each character linked the next part of the game together. Well, as far as I'm aware, our character is completely new to the Stalker franchise and has no affiliation to these old characters. It is fantastic to see the inclusion of them nonetheless. It's also great to see that they've introduced them in such a way that the newcomers to the franchise don't actually need to know who they are for the story to make sense. There were a lot of smaller features which I really enjoyed as well, such as having a global personal stash in each friendly town which were all linked together, which had seemingly unlimited space, which allowed you to stock up on ammo or store any weapons you wanted to keep for later on. Weapon attachments could also be equipped or removed in the field without needing a workbench, which lets you swap gun sights or anything else without needing to go back to a town. The best part of all this is that weapon attachments, as far as I could tell, didn't actually modify a weapon stats at all, short of the weight, which unfortunately is your forever enemy in this game. Visually, if you look at the game from a distance, it is pretty stunning, although I did encounter a couple of areas that had some pretty egregious texture issues. However, it does suffer from the usual problems that you see in Unreal Engine 5 games, such as the ghosting, inverse ghosting, and the occasional fuzzy graphics depending on which textures are actually used, though the latter does remain quite rare in this title. I've only seen a handful of them. It is also worth noting that this is the third UE5 game that has actually caused my power supply safety to trip, and I've had to actually disconnect it from the power source to get my PC to turn back on. Now I will admit that it is an older power supply at this point in time, and it may just be showing its age, but I think it's a bit strange that only Unreal 5 games have caused this problem. It's probably worth being aware of. My primary concerns with Stalker 2 at this point in time is that it requires mods to provide an actual enjoyable experience, at least in my opinion. Even if you exclude the bloated enemy health, there's simple issues such as the mouse X and Y sensitivity being scaled differently, which necessitates a mod just to reset them back to equal values, which is a problem that caused me no end of frustrations simply trying to work out for the longest time why aiming was so incredibly awkward. When I went to check the Nexus for mods, I did find that a lot of what was available consisted of quality of life fixes like performance improvements and the aforementioned mouse sensitivity adjustments. Even the upcoming planned patch primarily addresses only minor fixes which won't actually resolve the game's deeper issues, aside from dealing with some bugs that actually lock player progression, one of which has completely ruined my current save by not spawning any NPCs and locking up an entire area. It's really disappointing to see that the devs are actually more focused on fixing the surface level problems rather than trying to look into and fix the deeper problems with the game. And given that I'm on the receiving end of one of those game-breaking bugs, I do absolutely understand that they need to be fixed, but the problem is that it doesn't look like they're looking any further into the future than just fixing those small bugs, which is a problem. Despite how much I do enjoy Stalker 2, there's an undeniable feeling of lifelessness in the world. Most of the time, I spent my time just wandering around without purpose. Occasionally, I found something to do along the way, but most of the time, there's nothing to break up the monotony. The handful of unfunny jokes that the NPCs constantly tell aren't helping the situation at all either, and while I dislike comparing it to Fallout 4, it's hard not to draw parallels in this regard. Fallout 4, while disastrously flawed in its own right, offered settlement building as a side activity which provided a welcome diversion whenever you grew bored of wandering. In contrast, Stalker 2 lacks any engaging activities for players to enjoy between doing missions. Even if you focus on side quests, the interest tends to fade fairly quickly. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this may be partly due to the A-Life being broken, but I believe a dynamic NPC system won't entirely alleviate the blandness of the world. To me, it just feels soulless and artificial, which is a big shame because I genuinely do want to like this game. I have no doubts that should I be able to salvage my save game and finish playing through, that I will actually replay the game a second time, but I can't help but wish that there were more things to engage with in the world. Something simple, even like a little card activity in each town to earn extra coupons, or more varied conversations. Even some kind of limited artifact event would help add a little bit of depth and life to the world. At the end of the day, I do believe that Stalker 2 will become an enjoyable game. It'll just take a month or two, once the studio has a chance to address all the core problems with bugs, and more critically, this quest soft and hard locks that prevent NPC spawns and consequently lock you out of doing any quests. During those couple of months period, the modding community will likely continue to refine their art and keep making changes to the game. Potentially, some may end up being redundant if the developers do fix issues like enemy sponginess and the dysfunctional economy. I find the standard edition's price of $90 Australian slightly high, but not by enough to actually discourage me from purchasing the game. The Ultimate Edition at 170 Australian though is well overpriced for what it offers. The in-game weapons and armor that are offered by the Ultimate Edition aren't particularly unique, and aside from the art book and the soundtrack, you're left with 2 guaranteed expansions of undetermined length and quality and an undisclosed number of DLCs, which isn't really the most appealing sales pitch when that could ultimately end up being 0. To further add frustration, you can't upgrade your game after purchasing or buy the Ultimate Edition's Season Pass separately, which feels a little bit unfair to cautious buyers such as myself. Also, while I was writing this review, it was brought to my attention that CD-Keys actually has the game on sale for North America and European regions, which is something I'm going to be really briefly critical of, because I think it's incredibly scummy to put a game on sale for A, specific regions, and B, that it's only been out for less than a week, so RIP anybody who bought the game early. That said though, if you do live in one of those regions and you have been on the fence about the game, the price tag does scream buy now, so definitely go and pick it up if you are somewhat interested in the game, especially if you're interested in that Ultimate Edition, because this is the price that the game should actually be at. All in all, I do believe that the game is definitely worth picking up once the developers resolve those critical issues. Even if you need to hit up the Nexus for some mods to balance the gameplay towards what you feel is comfortable, there's a lot to appreciate in Stalker 2, especially considering how visually impressive it can be as long as you don't look too closely. If the developers can polish up the game a bit further, getting rid of those game-breaking bugs and maybe adding a little bit more to the world, I genuinely hope that it develops into an outstanding experience for both newcomers and veterans of the franchise alike. But thank you for everybody who dropped in. If you did get this far through the video though, please consider leaving a like and a subscribe, and apparently the bell lets you know whenever I'm posting or live, so make sure you hit that. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you guys next time.